I am a sixth-generation Unitarian Universalist. In this day and age, that may be considered a record. Look at this congregation. 85% of the people in this room did not grow up within the faith. So being a sixth-generation Unitarian Universalist is somewhat unusual. My UU history goes back just about 100 years. My great-great-great-grandmother, Rose Davis, was the first Unitarian in my family. In 1882, she married Isaac Choik. They had 13 children, only 8 of which lived to be adults. They lived in Brooklyn, and of course, they were poor. Isaac died in 1917 when their youngest child, who I know as Aunt Viola, was only 10 years old. At that time, the settlement movement was very popular. The settlement movement was a reformist social movement with a goal of getting the rich and poor in society to live more closely together in an interdependent community. Its main object was the establishment of settlement houses in poor urban areas, in which volunteer middle-class settlement workers would live, hoping to share knowledge and culture with and alleviate the poverty of their low-income neighbors. The settlement houses provided services such as daycare, education, and health care to improve the lives of the poor in these areas. Basically, these settlement houses functioned on a philosophy of scientific philanthropy, a belief that instead of giving direct relief, charities should give resources to the poor so they could break out of the circle of poverty. Now, fortunately for my family, the First Unitarian Society of Brooklyn, or First Church, had one such settlement house. My great-great-grandmother decided that since they were providing meals, she would take their family there. The church building is quite large, and the Willow Street Chapel was used for the immigrant families. The services held there were separate from the regular church services. What was interesting was that although the church was reaching out to these poor families, they didn't want them mixing with the upstairs church members. Ultimately, my family joined the upstairs church and remained active in its activities. Isaac and Rose's oldest child was Hattie Sarah Choik, born April 3rd, 1883, my great-great-grandmother. Hattie married Edward Theodore Bloom in 1901. They had 2 children, Madeline F., my great-grandmother, or Graham, and Arthur. Like many men in the Choik extended family, Edward was not reliable. When Hattie died in 1920, 18-year-old Madeline F. was left to take care of 12-year-old Arthur. Edward was gone. Madeline F. married William Joseph Dixon in 1924. They had 2 children, Madeline H., my grandmother, and William R. William Joseph left the family during the Depression and was rarely seen again. My grandmother married my grandfather, Robert Thompson Woolnough, in 1950. They had 2 children, Merrill and Gail. Gail married Peter Costanza in 1978, and they had me and my sister Valerie. I married Barb Antolick in 2006, and we have 2 girls, Alexis and Emily. While members at First Church, my family was active in all sorts of ways, teaching Sunday school, serving on the Board of Trustees, being part of a ministerial search committee, or 2, bringing up many generations of children in the religious education program, greeting newcomers week after week after week, and writing a history of the church. My Aunt Mabel was president of the Women's Alliance for over 50 years and served as a representative to the May meetings, now called General Assembly. At the time, these things were unheard of, no less by a woman. As a whole, my family has seen people come and go. They have seen a good number of ministers serve the church. They have watched generations of families grow up. They have known countless people who have died. My great-great-grandmother found in the Unitarian Church a caring community, a place that was open to intellectual inquiry, a place that would help them raise her children in a liberal religious atmosphere. All of this is what I think of when I think of what it means to be a member of a church, what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. I think of Rose and her history with the First Church in Brooklyn. I think of all that my family has seen and heard and learned as a part of that congregation, and the fact that their commitment to Unitarian Universalism has remained faithful throughout. And we, in the context of this loving, challenging religious community, remain ever open to learning new things. Unitarian Universalism has changed a great deal since its North American origins over 200 years ago. Both Unitarianism and Universalism began in part as transplanted European religious movements that made their way across the Atlantic, but more so as homegrown American religions, born in reaction to the conservative Calvinist doctrine that was becoming popular at the time. Like all religious traditions, we have historical figures who played prominent roles in the founding of the faith. On the Universalist side, we have John Murray, who brought Universalism over from England. We have Hosea Ballou, whose theological writings did much to clarify the Universalist position. On the Unitarian side, we have Joseph Priestley, who, like John Murray, brought his religious faith with him from England. We sort of have Thomas Jefferson, who, although he was never a member of the Unitarian Church, claimed that he subscribed to the Unitarian philosophy, who believed that by the end of his generation, Unitarianism would be the dominant religion in this country, and who created his own Bible using the words of Jesus, but leaving out the miracles and the resurrection. We have a lively and interesting history in this country. Unitarianism, in particular, came out of the same intellectual tradition that spawned the American Revolution and the values of equality and religious freedom that were so much a part of the time. Universalism arose, reacting against the same conservative Christianity, but focused on a different subject. For Universalists, the doctrine that concerned them was that of salvation. Calvinists believed in predestination, that certain people were destined for heaven and others for hell. Even those Christians who did not believe that our eternal fates were sealed before we were even born believed that some of humanity was headed for eternal punishment at God's hand. The Universalists disagreed. They believed that God is so good, that God's love for humanity is so great, that every person will, in the end, be saved, that there is no such thing as hell. From our modern perspective, it is next to impossible to imagine how radical this view must have been 200 years ago. Both Unitarianism and Universalism held that one of the central callings of religion was to create God's kingdom here on earth by working for greater peace and justice wherever and whenever possible. Both also were, from the beginning, non-creedal faiths. In other words, although there were many attempts to articulate the basic theological understandings of each tradition, there was no statement of belief that people had to sign on when they wanted to join the church. Much has happened since those first articulations of American Unitarianism and Universalism. In the past 200 years, Unitarianism and Universalism have been influenced by the Transcendentalists, Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, the Scientific Revolution, formal biblical criticism, and humanism, to name a few. The two religions joined together in 1961, a move that had been considered for over a century. We have changed from a religious tradition that is clearly and explicitly Christian to one that embraces the religious pluralism we find in our world and within our own congregations. And by no means have we finished changing. No wonder why we sometimes have difficulty knowing who we are. As I was thinking about how much we've changed over the last 200 years, I find myself wondering what our religious forebears would think if they suddenly found themselves here on a Sunday morning in the 21st century. Would they recognize our Unitarian Universalism as part of the same religious tradition they had a hand in creating? Just what do we have in common with those who founded our faith? Because Unitarianism and Universalism developed in response to the dominant religious culture of the country, and because a majority of modern-day Unitarian Universalists still come to our congregations from other religious traditions, one of the biggest dangers we face in defining ourselves is that we do so only in negative terms. We don't believe this, we have rejected that, and so on. Sometimes it is easier to see what makes us different from other religious traditions than what it is we actually have in common with each other. It makes sense, perhaps, that we both as individuals and as a denomination need first to separate ourselves from those traditions or ways of thinking that we have left behind, whatever they may be. But unless we move beyond that, unless we find some way to define ourselves in the positive, we will be stuck forever, reacting to someone else's religious tradition. It is both a gift and a challenge that so many in our churches come to Unitarian Universalism as adults. On the one hand, we are forever learning from new perspectives, forever challenged to continue the search in ways that invite people in. At the same time, it can be easy to lose sight of our history, to fall into the trap of believing that each of us gets to invent Unitarian Universalism in our own image, turning it into whatever we want it to be. As I look back over the writings of the early Unitarians and Universalists, the ways in which we have changed are, at first, more apparent than what has remained true about the tradition. No doubt if some of those men, and they were mostly men, at least in the beginning, were to appear among us this morning, they too would be initially struck by how much has changed. Probably what they would notice first was that there was a woman in the pulpit. They would probably be surprised to discover that the Bible isn't our only or even primary text. They might wonder at some of the changes we've made in the words to our hymns, taking out much of the theistic language and almost all of the gender-specific language. They would probably have to get used to our references to religious traditions from around the world. I know they would be puzzled at our casual dress. But I don't think that they would have to hang around long to discover that we do, in fact, belong to the same religious family. They would see that our commitment to ongoing inquiry and openness to religious truths is a continuation of their own. They would see that in our commitment to equality for women and for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, and in our work to abolish racism, both within our own walls and in the wider world, we have followed the example of their efforts to abolish slavery. They would see that we continue to struggle to live up to the divine possibility each of us have within us, and that we continue to believe in our potential for growth and goodness. There are, I believe, two things that are essential to the Unitarian Universalism. Two things which hold us together as a community, which tie us to our past, and which will carry us into the future. The first is the core belief of Unitarian Universalist theology, the belief that is, as Unitarian minister Theodore Parker reminds us in his sermon, that as human beings, we are called to love the Lord, your God, with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. I'll repeat it. That as human beings, we are called to love the Lord, your God, with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and to love your neighbors as yourself. This may not be the language that most of us use anymore, but if you look at the principles on the wall, you will see that in many ways they reflect a modern understanding of this ancient declaration. The first part of this commandment tells us that we are to discover and love the divine, the sacred, God, with all our mind, heart, and soul. We are to find that which calls us beyond ourselves, that which reminds us that we have the ability to serve truth and goodness wherever it is found. I believe that whether or not we find God to be a useful concept for ourselves personally, the concept that we must find something of ultimate worth upon which to base our lives holds true for all of us. The second half, love thy neighbor as thyself, reflects how we want to act in this world. We strive to act with justice and compassion, with awareness of our connection to all those around us. Over the centuries, we may have learned more and more about what this means, but it has always been central to who we are. Whatever changes our theological perspectives, our religious language and rituals have gone through over the years, Whatever we have learned about the world and about ourselves, this call to love our God and to love our neighbor as ourselves remains as powerful and central as it has been since the first time it was spoken. The second thing that holds us together as Unitarian Universalists is not a particular theological belief or ritual, but rather how we go about doing religion. We hold that the process of religion is ongoing, that there is always more truth to be found, that our faith is never finished. We believe that revelation is not sealed. That which is ultimate is continually being shown to us through the sacred scriptures of the world's religions, through science and study, through the natural world, through the arts, through human relationships, through our own experiences in the world. We believe that, although most of the religious searching happenings within community, our spiritual journeys are our own, and every one of us has the freedom to make his or her particular journey in his or her own particular way. This does not mean that people can believe whatever they want. We hold people to the integrity of their own truth, but within the bonds of honesty and integrity, within the bonds of loving that which is ultimate and loving our neighbor, there is tremendous amount of room for religious exploration and learning, for diversity of belief and diversity of practice. It may not seem like a lot, these two things that hold us together as part of the same religious tradition. They may seem simple, even obvious, but the best and deepest religious truths are simple. That is what we do with it is what we do with them that gets complicated. For now, let me just say that simple doesn't always mean easy. It is often a surprise to people who are new to Unitarian Universalism just how powerful our history is, how much, despite the surface differences, it informs who we are today. As a sixth-generation Unitarian Universalist, I feel deeply connected to our history, not only because of the history of my faith tradition and association, but because it is also the history of my family. I can see, almost daily, how much this religious tradition has shaped me and those I love. I am incredibly grateful that my great-great-grandmother Rose chose to become a part of the Unitarian tradition. I am grateful that the next 4 generations chose to stick with it. I am grateful to be able to spend my life serving this faith that I believe is deserving of our allegiance. Thank you.